Hey, it's Lee Halliday, and today we're going to continue looking through the React testing library. I've been going through some of the examples and sort of taking what's a pretty big example and trying to rebuild it, so I understand it myself, but maybe I can help explain what's going on to other people as well. And today we are looking at how to test React Redux within the React testing library. So if we go over to code, here I've got a little project set up where I've been adding little components and tests for those components. And we'll start by creating a counter component. So we have to import React, and we are going to need to import something called connect as well from React Redux. I guess at this point I should say the two extra packages I've added for this test would be Redux and React Redux. Those are the two you need to do to run this code, along with React and the React testing library. Okay, so we are going to declare a function. So we got function called counter, which takes in some stuff, and it returns, we'll say a div, and in here we've got a button that will be plus. And when you click this button, we will call a function called increment. So we'll have another button you can guess with a minus, and it will be called decrement. And then in the middle, we will just put, doesn't matter, we can have a span that shows the current count for this counter component. Okay, so where are these functions coming from? They're going to come in as props, so we will receive the increment function, the decrement function, and the count function. Okay, so we've got our component, but with Redux you always have to connect, hence why we imported the connect function. You have to connect your sort of dumbish function to the Redux store. So the way you do that is by using the connect function, and you can pass connect function two things here. The first is a function that maps your state that's in your Redux store into props that will be passed to your sort of dumb component here that's just visual. And so we will say that we will declare a function that has some state, and it returns, so an implicit return here, and it will return an object, and this object will have a count property that has the value of the state.count. So we've taken care of passing in, we've taken all of our state, which was declared in Redux, and we've sort of stripped off just the count property that we're passing in as a prop. So that's why we have access to this count here. The second argument you can pass to the connect function is something that's called map dispatch to props. So this allows you to sort of pass in functions that will dispatch events or actions to your Redux store for it to be able to modify the state that's in the store. So we'll do another arrow function that receives dispatch, and it will implicitly return an object. In this object, we need to define our increment and our decrement functions that can be called when you click the plus or the minus buttons. So increment, what will increment be? It will be an arrow function that calls dispatch. And to dispatch, whenever you call dispatch, it wants to receive something called an action. An action is simply an object that at least has a type property, and we are declaring this as the type of increment. So this will eventually get dispatched, or it will call our reducer in Redux. If all these terms you've never heard of before, probably should step back and look at like an intro to Redux. I believe in the past I've done a video on that. So just if you're lost, stop now, go learn about some of the basics of Redux, and then come back here to this. So we've got our increment function set up. So now we want our decrement function. So we will call dispatch and pass an object with a type of decrement. Okay. So what connect returns is a function you need to call passing in the component that you basically want to connect to your Redux store. So this sort of produces a high order component that wraps around counter and passes in our count, the increment function, and the decrement function. So the only thing we haven't done yet is export this as default. So whenever we import counter, we're not just importing this plain component, we're actually importing the connected version of that component that has all the Redux functionality being passed into it. So we've got our component. Hopefully it works, but really I don't know yet. So let's go write some tests to see if it does. All right, so we've got counter.test.js. And here there's like a million imports that hopefully I'll be able to remember. So we need React from React. We need something called create store from Redux. So this allows us to create our Redux data store. We need to import a provider from React Redux. What this provider allows us to do is anytime you want to be able to connect a component to the Redux store, the only way that can work is if this all lives within inside the provider. And what that does is it gives the ability to provide your Redux store to the connected components. So we need that. That's React specific, which is why it comes from React Redux package. We want to import a few functions from React testing library. So what we want is the render function, the fire event function, and the cleanup function from React testing library. Okay. We next want to import a few helper functions to make testing with React testing library easier in Jest. So we've got Jest DOM extend expect. That gives us a few extra functions like expect it to have like a text value and whatnot. Okay, and finally we can import our connected counter component from counter. All right, so we got all our imports set up. I'm going to close this to give us a bit more space. And why don't we start our tests over here so that we can see when things are passing and failing. Right now it's failing because we do not even have a single test. So the first thing we'll do is we'll just have our after each. So this is something that comes from Jest, and we can pass it a function to call after each test. So we want it to call our React testing library cleanup function. All right, and now let's just starting our first test. So it renders with Redux will be the very first test that we're going to write. And as we get in here, typically you would do something like const get by maybe test ID or get by text from render equals render our component. I believe like that. Okay, so what's it saying? Other than a lot of could not find store in the context. Okay, so what this is I mentioned anytime you want to use a connected component, it needs to live within inside of a provider. So we haven't yet wrapped this counter with a provider. So let's do that. And to do that, we will create a little helper function. So as we look at the example that they give, so far we've built our little counter and we've started to write our first test. Now we're going to go up and they have a little helper function called render with Redux, which basically just helps you build a little wrapper that easily renders your component inside of a provider. So we will create a function called render with Redux. And what tripped me up a little bit is that you have the ability to pass it the component that you want to render inside of a provider. That makes sense. But they had some complicated sort of destructuring going on here. So what it has is some initial state and then store. And if you don't pass store, we will create a store. So create store, what does it want to receive? So create store came from the Redux package. It wants to receive the reducer, which we haven't created yet, and the initial state. So where did initial state come from? It actually comes from over here. So with destructuring, early destructured variables can be used later on in your destructuring statement. So initial state came from here. But none of this will work if you don't pass any of it. So we need to say, if you don't even pass a second argument, what is it going to be? It is going to default value be empty. Okay. So we need a reducer, but before we even get there, let's just return, and we want to return the wrapped. Actually, how would this work? No, it's a little complicated. Okay, I think I got it now. So we're going to return an object that is the splatted or like destructured, whatever render returns. So render comes from React testing library, and render wants to receive the component to render. So we are going to give it the provider that will wrap whatever component was passed into this function. So that will end up being the counter. So counter will live inside the provider. Provider always needs a store so that it knows what Redux store to grab the data from, and when you're connecting a store to a component, what store to use. So we will give it the store that came from the input arguments here. And now instead of calling just render, we will call render with Redux. Okay. And now it's failing because we've told the create store, here's my reducer, but we haven't actually declared a reducer yet. So let's do that. So we've got our reducer function, and reducer functions typically receive 2 arguments. The first is the previous or the current state of your Redux store. And we can actually, if nothing, sort of the first time it's called, it's probably undefined. So we can say what it should be when it's completely undefined. And you don't need to declare it here. You could actually do const initial, we'll call it starting state, just so that we don't get confused with this variable here. And it is count of 0. So the state is equal to starting state if that's if it's an undefined value. So it would just be equal to that. And we also receive the action. So if you go back to here, the action would be this object that is dispatched or sent to our reducer. Okay, so a typical reducer has a switch statement that switches on the action type. And then we have a case statement for each of the different types we can have. So we have an increment type. And what do we want to do if we've been dispatched the increment? We want to return the current state, so we'll create a copy of it. And then we'll take the count and we will increase it by 1. So you can imagine what decrement would look like. Return the previous state and take the count and remove 1. So if this thing receives any other type that it's not really prepared to handle, we can have a default case where it simply returns the state as is. Cool. So now that we have this, we have our first test passing. We haven't actually tested for anything yet, but that sort of proves, hey, it's at least able to render this thing. So now what we could do is, I don't think we actually need GetByText in this one. So just GetByTest ID. So we will expect that when we GetByTest ID, so GetByTest ID is a function that is returned from render that allows us to find elements that don't necessarily have text that we can search them for. So if we look back here at the counter, we have to add a data test ID to this span, and that gives us the ability to find it easily in our React testing library tests. So now we can say get by the test ID count and expect it to have text content 0. And we can just make sure it fails first. So we said 5, but it's 0, and that's because the initial state, or when it's undefined, if nothing's there, it has a count of 0, which gets passed as map state to props and rendered inside of this span here, right here. So if we update that to 0, it should be working. So that's our first test. Our second test can be, it can increment. Okay, so we will do the same sort of thing here. We will render it out, and we'll add a second one, GetByText. And the reason we want this, you can see, is we're going to be using it to see what's inside the count. But GetByText we are going to use to find the button. So the button text for increment is just a plus string. So what we can do is, for the first time, we're going to use this fire event function we imported. And the way that works is you say fire event, and you tell it what event you want to fire. And then you have to tell it what element to fire the click event on. So we will say GetByText. So go find the element that has a plus text and click it. So clicking it should trigger the increment function, which gets dispatched to our reducer, which modifies the state by increasing the count by 1. That forces a re-render, which should leave us with this count having the value of 1 inside of it. So if we copy this here that found count, we can say that it should have 1 inside. So it's still working. Since it's so similar, let's test the decrement. So we want to find the minus, and since it starts at 0, it would give us -1. Cool, so we've got 3 tests working now. If we go back to this sort of complicated second argument that allows us to override the initial state and allows us to also override the store, let's make sure that the test works if we start with a different initial state and if we start with sort of a different custom store. So it can have initial state. Okay, so I'm actually just going to copy this one for that. So we'll render with Redux and we'll pass in a different initial state. So our initial state will be an object that, say, has a count of 5. Okay, so this is actually good. People messaging me, what? All right, so we said look for 0, but we got 5, which is actually good because that's the initial state we started with. So we just have to update our test to make it pass. And then the last one we'll do is it can have custom store. So let's say that we copy the first one again and we'll modify it. And we want to be able to have a custom store. So we can actually just declare a custom store here. And we'll call our create store function, which comes from Redux. And a store, this function receives a reducer. So that was that guy up here that had the switch statement. Let's create a bogus store that basically has a reducer, which always implicit return an object that has a count of, let's say, 30. Doesn't matter. So our store, if we pass in this store here, so passes, but it's passing just sort of by mistake. If we say 35, it will fail. It's because in the 30, there's a 0, so that's why this passed. But now that it's 35, there's no 0 there. So that means we just need to update this to 35, and now everything's working. So just to go over what we did today, we started by creating our counter component, which receives a couple functions and just a value. So where do those come from? They come from the connection of Redux to our component. So we mapped our state, passing in the count, and we mapped our dispatch functions, passing in an increment and a decrement function, which both dispatch actions to our reducer. So if we come over to our test, after we imported a million things, we start going through and we just say after each test, clean things up. Let's define our Redux reducer so it can receive the different actions and modify the state in whatever way that action sort of requires. We created a helper function because it's sort of a bit of a pain to wrap a provider that has a store around the component we want to test. We just did this generically so that we can reuse it for all of our tests. If you had a whole bunch of different connected components, this probably wouldn't live within this test, but you'd have one that you can import for all of your different connected component tests. So what this did is it received the component, and then we could override the initial state and or override the store that is passed to the provider that wraps around our connected component. So now our first test was simply if we render the counter and then we use the GetByText ID to find the count element, it should have 0, which is the initial state. Count is 0 if we don't pass in anything. We made sure that we can increment. This one we used an additional GetByText to be able to find the plus element, the button, and we fired a click event on it, and then we tested to make sure that it re-rendered correctly with the new value in our Redux store. We did the same with decrement, and then we just went ahead and made sure that this store works if we have a different initial value. In this example, maybe you're testing, if there's some local state, maybe the store starts off with a different initial value because there's some previous state to go off of. So we tested that. And then we tested a custom store. I don't really know the purpose of this, but the reason I included it was just to be complete with, we wanted to go through this example of React Redux. And in their example, they also did that it can render with a custom store. And they fired a couple events that had a hard-coded, the store is always going to have a count of 1,000. So they incremented, still 1,000. Decremented, still 1,000. But I think our test is good enough to show, they even say this is a silly store that can never be changed. But it's just to sort of show how you can work with Redux in some different ways inside React Testing Library. That's it for today. Hope you enjoyed the video. Take care. Bye.